Hello, everyone. Welcome to STEMEY's biology lecture, chapter 2, chemical context of life. So concept 2.1, matter consists of chemical elements in pure form and in combinations called compounds. So the definition of matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Now this can be rocks, oils, gases, and metals, pretty much anything, like it says, anything that takes up space and has mass. Now, an element is a substance that cannot be broken down to other substances by chemical reactions. So this is the smallest that you can get. Everything on the periodic table is an element, and there's a total of 92 elements that have been naturally discovered. Now, if you look at the periodic table, there are more than 92 elements, but that is because some have been made in a lab. Now, a compound is a substance consisting of two or more different elements combined in a fixed ratio and consists of different characteristics from their elements. Essential elements are 20 to 25% of the natural elements found, and this means an organism needs them to live a healthy life. Now, humans need 25 elements while plants only need 17. And the really like top tier most used ones are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen because they make up around 96% of living matter. Now, concept 2.2, an element's properties depend on the structure of its atoms. Now, subatomic particles, super important, influence so much of the world. There are three kinds: neutrons, protons, and electrons. Protons and electrons are electrically charged. Protons have one positive charge, and electrons have one negative charge, and the neutrons, hence the name, is neutral. So the atomic nucleus is where the protons and neutrons are stored. And so the nucleus is positively charged because neutrons are, again, neutral. The electrons make up a cloud of negative charge. And so we'll get more into that later about what that specifically means. Now, the atomic number and atomic mass. All atoms of an element have the same number of protons in their nuclei, and it is what makes them that element. The atomic number is used to tell number of protons and is unique to that element. If you look at the periodic table, it is arranged according to the atomic number, so it is super important. When neutral, they have equal number of protons and electrons. Now, the mass number is the total number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus of an atom. Moving on, we have isotopes. See, these are the different atomic forms of the same element. Again, protons can't be lost because that changes the identity of that element. So the electrons are the ones that are either gained or lost and is what gives the atom a charge. Even though they have slightly different masses, they behave identically in chemical reactions. So remember that. And unstable isotopes are radioactive isotopes. And this is where the nucleus decays spontaneously, giving off particles and energy. Now, these radioactive tracers are used as diagnostic tools in medicine. They are very useful in biological research in medicine, which is one of their many pros, but one of their many cons is that the radiation from the decaying isotopes can also damage cellular molecules. So it has its benefits and it has its negatives. Next is radiometric dating, used to tell the age of fossils. So this is super important because fossils give the evidence for evolution and shows the difference of organisms from now and then, how things have changed, how the earth has developed, and how living life has also developed. Now, half-life is when the parent isotope decays into its daughter's isotope, or at a fixed rate until 50% remains. The half-life is not affected by temperature, pressure, or pretty much any other environmental factors. Now, radiometric dating is used to measure the ratio of different isotopes and compare half-lives. So as you can see in this picture, at 0 half-lives, completely parent isotope. At 1 half-life, half of it is parent isotope and half of it is daughter. At 2 half-lives, that parent becomes into a fourth and the daughter continues. It just gets half and half of the new material. Now, the energy levels of electrons. This is where I said we would come back to it. So electrons vary in the amount of energy they possess. And just a little brief reminder, energy is defined as the capacity to cause change. Potential energy is defined as consists of the energy something has based on structure or location. And the energy of electrons is related to the distance from the nucleus. So these electron shells, which were the electron clouds, quote unquote, that I mentioned before, have electrons in them and consist of different levels. In this diagram, you can see that they are seen as circles around the nucleus, and in pretty much most diagrams, that's what they are shown as. Now, energy increases as isotopes get further from the nucleus. When an electron absorbs energy, it jumps electron shells, and it is called an excited state. Now, eventually, it does dump down, and that releases a photon, but that's more information for a later topic. Now, electron distribution and chemical properties. So characteristics of an atom are determined by the distribution of electrons in the electron shell. On the periodic table, the elements are arranged in 3 rows and periods depending on the amount of electrons as well as the orbitals, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, the behavior essentially depends on the valence electrons, which is the outer electrons, and are stored in the valence shell. And this is at the very outskirts of the nucleus. Now, electron orbitals. This is the three-dimensional space where an electron is found 90% of the time. So the likelihood of finding an electron is in their own orbital. Now, the first electron shell is only one spherical orbital, and this is called S. The second shell has the S orbital as well as 3p orbitals, and so on. There is also D and F. Now, as you can see here in this diagram, it has the S orbital, then the P orbital, then the S, the P, and the D, all the way up to the G. And so as this n equals 2 is just like the rings, the electron orbitals, just the different levels, as you can see. Okay, concept 2.3. The formation and function of molecules and ionic compounds depend on chemical bonding between atoms. So chemical bonds are the interactions between atoms that keep them close together. The strongest are covalent bonds in molecules and ionic bonds in dry compounds, which we'll go over right now. So covalent bonds are the sharing of a pair of valence electrons by 2 atoms. This is represented in a drawing by a single line, and that line represents 2 electrons and is called a single bond. Now, if you see 2 lines in a drawing, that means double bond and represents 4 electrons. Sorry, I just had to take a sip of water. Now, the double bond is going to be much stronger than the single bond because it is shorter, so that's where it gets its strength and has more of a charge since it's 4 electrons. Now, more info on the covalent bond. Atoms and molecules attract shared bonding electrons differently, and this depends on the element. This is measured as electronegativity. So electronegativity is where the attraction of a particular atom of the electrons of a covalent bond. The more electronegative it is, the more strongly it pulls on shared electrons. Now, this affects nonpolar covalent bonds, and this is where the electrons are shared equally because the 2 atoms have equal electronegativity. Now, the opposite of that is a polar covalent bond, and this is where the electronegativity is different, so the electrons are not shared equally and is pulled to the side. Here you can see with the hydrogen, it has 1 electron is 1 proton, the 2 bond, now it's sharing 2 electrons, and that is a single bond because it's 2 electrons. Here it is shown with dots, but it also, like before, can be shown with a line. Now we move on to the second type of bonding, ionic bonds. These ions are formed by electrons being drawn to the electronegative atoms and is what you need to form ionic bonds. So cation is when a positively charged ion, and so that means it loses an electron. Remember, like before, it can't lose a proton, it can only lose electrons. An ion is a negative charged ion, so it has gained an electron. A way to remember this is a cation is positive. Get it? Cat positive. So that's the way to remember it. Because of their opposite charges, they are drawn together, and this causes them to form the ionic bond. Now, there are also compounds that are formed by ionic bonds, and they are known as salts, or, if it wasn't obvious, ionic compounds. The environment does affect the strength of the ionic bonds. And so here you can just see some ionic bondings between a sodium and a chloride atom. The sodium loses, the chloride gains, and that makes them bond together. Now, weak chemical interactions, just going to cover this topic briefly. There is more information. The strongest chemical bonds are usually the covalent bonds. Weak chemical interactions can be found in many molecules, such as the ionic bond in a solution. Hydrogen bonds is where the hydrogen atom has a positively charge, and so that is attracted to a different electronegative atom with a negative charge. And this only occurs between hydrogen and Nuff just stands for the electrons, so nitrogen, oxygen, and fluoride. That's just a little shorthand to remember. Some more information, the molecule shape and function. A molecule has a characteristic size and shape. The shapes are determined by the positions of the atom's orbitals. This is where the S, P, D, and F orbitals form different shapes as talked about before. Now the last topic we have, 2.4, chemical reactions make and break chemical bonds. So chemical reactions are the making and breaking of chemical bonds, and this is written with reactants on the left, an arrow, and then products on the right. Reactants are the starting materials and products are the resulting/final material. Coefficients are used to indicate the number of molecules in the chemical reactions and must be the same on the reactant side as it is on the product side. Reactants cannot be created or destroyed, so the atoms are just rearranged when they turn into products. This does sound similar and is because of the law of the conservation of mass, kind of like how energy can't be created or destroyed, but just rearranged and transferred. Sometimes there is a double arrow, which means that products can reverse back into reactants, but that is for a later date. Here you can see just an example of the reactants and products of photosynthesis. And as you can see, if you were to count them, there are equal molecules on each side. And that is all the information I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a lovely day and come back.